Hello everyone and welcome back to Ace Afrikaans, where today we're going to take a look at everything you need to know about changing a sentence into the future tense. So if we take a look at our standard word order, we will need to put sal into our first verb position. This is our future tense indicator, an auxiliary or a modal verb. Sometimes people also tend to use gaan, but they mean different things. Gaan means going to, and sal means I will. We tend to prefer using will, although often in just everyday language we can use both. Now, the verb that used to be in the first verb position is going to be moved to the second verb position. Let's take a look at an example of how this works. Ek skryf vandag 'n brief stadig in my kamer om te kommunikeer. So if we change it now to the future tense, you'll see that I have a verb 1 skryf, no verb 2, but in the future tense, sal is my new first verb, and skryf, that used to be my first verb, is now moved into that second verb position. Identifying my infinitive with om te kommunikeer, om te, and then a verb, but we'll take a look at infinitives in more depth in a future video. Now, obviously, there are a couple of interactions, so let's take a look at the first interaction we need to know about. When we have is in my first verb position, I am, or he is, or they are, am, is, and are in Afrikaans is all translated as is. We have no am, no are, everything just uses is. So just as in English, when is changes into the future tense, in Afrikaans it's going to be a different word. Ek sal being my future tense indicator, is moving to verb 2, it changes into wees. Just like in English, is will change, or am or are will change into be. Our second interaction is when we have het in our first verb position, but I do need to point out that het here means to have. Ek het 'n boek in my hand. I have a book in my hand. Het can be confusing because het is also a past tense indicator, so when we move them, they behave differently so that we can tell them apart. So, het meaning to have, when it is in my sentence, in the future tense, I'm going to put sal into my first verb position to indicate this is future tense. And when this het, meaning to have, moves to the second verb, it changes into he. And that's it. In my third interaction, we want to take a look at what happens if I already have a verb in my second verb position. Now, we already spoke about this in our video on word order, but it's important to note nonetheless. Ek wil vandag in my boek skryf. Wil in Afrikaans does not mean will. Wil means I want to. It is my will. So ek wil vandag in my boek skryf. I want to today in my book write, or I want to write in my book today. In the future tense, I'm going to put sal into my first verb position, and I'm just going to move my verb 1 to my second verb position without it moving past or through any verbs that are already there. For a more detailed explanation of the order that verbs need to be placed in the second verb position, take a look at our video on word order or sentence structure. So for our fourth interaction, we're going to take a look at what happens if we move two verbs that are joined. Sit and skryf. Generally, we're talking about these two things together. I sit and write in my book. I'm doing two things, and I just want to join these two verbs by en. We treat this both together as my first verb. So in the future tense, sal being my first verb, I then move my joined verbs, my double verbs, together into verb 2 as if they were the same verb. Now, of course, there's still two separate verbs. There's three separate words, but we just treat them as one for the purposes of moving them to my second verb position. Ek sal in my boek sit en skryf. I will in my book sit and write, or I will sit and write in my book. Our fifth interaction, when a verb moves to the second position and it's placed directly after a preposition that it interacts with. Now, what I mean by a preposition that it interacts with, in Afrikaans and in many languages, we have divisible verbs, meaning a verb that interacts with a preposition. Ek tel die blikkie op, I pick the can up, or I pick up the can. The verb pick and the preposition up work together. They're interactive. So to maintain the cohesion and the connection between the verb and the preposition with which it interacts, when this verb moves to the second verb position, it will be next to its preposition. And then to show that it is the same action, we have to join them together as a single word. So in my first verb position, I will put my future tense indicator sal, and then in my second verb position, I will now have the verb optel, even though tel is my verb and op is my preposition. The separation between those two concepts, they are still a verb and a preposition, they're just written together, is going to become important when we get into past tense. All right, let's take a look at a sixth interaction. Often tenses are started with time words, and this is going to be very, very common. So we need to maintain our first verb in the second position in our sentence. What I mean by this is when we start a sentence with our time, we need to also keep our first verb, sal, in that position. So let's take a look. Ek skryf vinnig in my book. I write quickly in my book. Now, in the future tense, I can begin with volgende jaar, which means next year. This now kind of implies that my sentence has to be in the future tense to make sense. Ek, you will see, is now moved past my first verb, that sal being my future tense indicator. This happens because in Afrikaans, the verb has to be in that second position. Afrikaans is a very verb-centric language, so please be careful that you do not now write your tense or your adverb or adverbial phrase of time, then your subject, and then your verb, because it's not going to make sense. Volgende jaar sal ek vinnig in my boek skryf. All right. I almost jumped ahead a little bit. Let's take a look at a variation on this interaction. When there is an adverb or an adverbial phrase of time, that is logically still correct if I start with a future tense time word. Let's take a look by what I mean by this. Ek skryf elke dag in my book. I write every day in my book. So there's already an adverbial phrase of time, elke dag, in that sentence. When I change it into the future tense, I begin with volgende jaar. Now that adverbial phrase, next year, is at the beginning of my sentence. Now the question arises, shouldn't I gather all of my time words there? Let's rather not, because this phrase, elke dag, doesn't really dictate when my sentence is happening as much as a tense. At least it doesn't designate a tense. It just designates that I'm doing it regularly within the given time frame. So volgende jaar is my time word, my time phrase. Then I input my first verb sal. Then I have my subject, ek. And then we can still add in this adverbial phrase of time, elke dag, in my boek skryf. Now you'll see that even though I have this time phrase at the beginning of my sentence, my verb is still second, so my sentence is cohesive, and then after that I can write my sentence in our sentence structure, stompie, or subject, time, object, manner, place, and infinitive. Next year, will I every day in my book write? Or next year, I will write in my book every day. And when I translate it, you can see that is where a lot of the mistakes come in for English first language speakers or people learning Afrikaans from an English perspective. Is I would say next year I will. But in Afrikaans, we have to say next year will I. So keep this in mind. It is a very, very common mistake. All right. Let's take a look at an expansion of this. Now, when we have an adverb or an adverbial phrase of time that does not logically fit into the time phrase that I'm started with. So in my sentence, ek skryf nou in my book. I write now in my book. That time phrase no implies present tense. So if I change my sentence into the future tense, volgende jaar, next year, all of a sudden it's illogical to also have a time phrase of present tense in my sentence. Volgende jaar sal ek in my boek skryf. You'll see in the answer that we now omit this adverbial or adverb of time because it does not follow, it is incoherent with a new time phrase that was added into the sentence. Next year will I, in my book, write. So remember, we still need vocabulary in order to know which words belong in which parts. So remember to practice every day, and I will see you all again next time.